Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new AF chat. I have a really cool guest today, and we're going to be talking about subscriptions. But as always, let's start in the beginning. Tell me what's in your cup and where are you from in the chat on if you're on YouTube or really if you're on anything that has a chat. X has a chat now, and we're streaming on X. LinkedIn has comments, which might make it into our chat. They do make it into the chat. So let me know where you're from, what you're drinking. We're going to wait for people to shuffle in. Then I'm going to bring in the guest. Dan has a bunch of really cool things to share when it comes to making more money with your subscriptions, and we'll get started. So I'll kick this off. I am drinking, what am I drinking? I'm drinking some sort of green tea. I think I have a lot of berries and stuff. It's the one that I always drink. Berries and pomegranate. Yeah, it's really cool. And I got some ginger in it this time because it's just really delicious. And I'm streaming from lovely, kind of sunny New York. It's been almost summer here in New York City, which is great. It's getting a little bit hot, but I'm okay with this. So yeah, let's see what's in the chat and go from there. Let's see. Oh, Texas, drinking tea. Hello, Texas, drinking tea. Drinking water. I see water in here too. Red Bull sugar-free. Man, it's been a long time since I had any sort of Red Bull. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we'll just leave it at a good thing for now. Again, we are very international. Belgium is in the house. Massachusetts is in the house. California is in the house. England is in the house. Sweden is in the house. Oh, wow. South Africa is in the house. All right, this is going to be a really good one. I hope you brought your good questions because we have a lot of firepower here and we can hopefully help you make more money with your apps, games, whatever you have, we will try. Websites? Did I hear a website? No, I didn't hear websites. We're talking about apps here. So I think it's a good time to get started. I see we have a lot of people already in the chat. Please continue to use the chat. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat. If you want to talk to each other, you can do that in the chat as well. I'm going to bring in our guest, Dan, if I remember how, like this. Hello, Dan. Welcome to
Hello, everyone.
NAF Chat.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So for those of you who don't know Dan, and I'll let Dan do his own introduction, but the brief overview is Dan has been doing subscription optimization and revenue optimization for a while. He has a newsletter and a blog, and they're pretty insightful. So if you are looking for something to read, I would highly recommend checking it out and signing up for the newsletter. And Dan currently consults on subscription optimization. So real hands-on experience here with us. We got a chance to chat a few weeks ago and we talked about a whole bunch of really interesting stuff. We were chatting even just before the live stream about a few of the things you can do and just not trying to, but diving into things. And it was a lot of fun. So welcome again, Dan. It's great to
Thank
finally
you.
have you on this. And tell us a little bit more about yourself. Hopefully a better job than what I
Yeah,
did.
sure. Sure. So I started in subscriptions during my time at Codecademy. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with Codecademy. It's like a B2C, mostly web-based subscription service that teaches people how to learn how to program. So I got there when there were about 20 people. I left when there were about 200 people. I ran growth there from about 10 million ARR to about 50 million ARR, with the help of a ton of wonderful people. Codecademy was like a great learning experience for how to run subscriptions because like I got to see a company that was at a pretty big scale and focused primarily on monetization. So Codecademy has a ton of traffic because it gives away like a great, really awesome free product. Most of like the growth problem at Codecademy is how you monetize and like how you get people to pay for the product and stay around. Really awesome experience. I learned a ton there, and I think was very fortunate that I could like sit in one job for 4 years and really like try a lot of tactics with a company that was doing a pretty good amount of revenue, really dial in what worked. I think after that, I was a PM at Uber for 2 years, running the home feed of Uber Eats. And now I consult for subscription products via my one-man consulting firm called Subscription Index.
I think that's a better overview. I like that.
Thank you.
So the goal of today is to talk about how to take a subscription app that exists and has tiers and has in-app purchases and has subscriptions, obviously, and do more with it. So I'll jump right in because I think the biggest question is, what kind of tools do you see as the tools that we can use to optimize? And we're going to focus on apps. There's some websites are also in this, desktop apps are also in this. But where do you start? What is the thought process behind? Let's see how we can squeeze more out of this.
Yeah, great question. So I think the way I normally frame this is like conceptually, there's kind of like six layers of a monetization system. There's kind of like where and how the paywall shows up. Like, do you have a free product? How are you positioning it? How are you selling it? What is the value prop? There's like the pricing and paywall structure. So like if you have multiple tiers, what's the difference between the tiers? How are they divided? Do people understand them? What do you charge for things? There's like the onboarding and purchase flow. So when someone wants to buy, how easily do they find things? This isn't a problem in mobile apps, but on desktop apps, how well does your checkout page work? How well are you handling errors? How you keep people like around in the product through things like lifecycle marketing, through things like selling them into longer plans to extend LTV. You have payment processing, and then you have anti-churn tactics. So I think the first thing I typically do when I look at an app is like map out what the company's doing across all those layers.
Hmm.
I think some layers have like really clear best practices, things like churn, and for the desktop apps, payment processing. Other things like pricing and paywall structures, a lot more like nuanced into the company.
All right, that's a big list. So we're going to try and talk about as
Yes.
many of those as we can. If there's something specific for the viewers who you really want to, that you really want to, you want us to talk about, whether it's churn or A/B testing or really anything else, drop it in the chat and we'll try to address it. But I want to start with something that you said about thinking about the audience. So if we think about the audience, how does that translate into thinking about your subscriptions?
It's a great question. Like the way I think about almost like the LTV ceiling for a product
Hmm.
is like who the users are and how long they have the problem that you're solving. So to take to two extremes, like B2B products tend to like serve really long-standing complicated problems. And if
Hmm.
you do it right, people will pay a ton of them. Consumer products like tend to solve shorter term problem sets. So shorter term problem sets are things like losing weight, learning a
Hmm.
language, getting fitter, like exploring a local area. Those are kind of like temporary problems that people
Hmm.
have. Contrast that with like paying for rent, paying utilities, like needing a place to live, needing a car, listening to music, watching streaming. Like those are like the longer term problem sets. So there's kind of like a different set of tactics that exist for each of them. I think if you're pursuing the really long-term use cases, it's more about like pumping value into the product, establishing supremacy, and keeping like the value of the product going for a long time. In the shorter term, it's like maximizing the window that you have and or like layering on other longer problems that people might have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think ultimately, if you start thinking about why they're even paying you,
Yeah,
it
exactly.
changes everything because now you're thinking about how they're paying you, why they're paying you, what can they pay you, what will they pay you, and also when do they not need you anymore.
Exactly. Like if you look at most of the weight loss products, especially the ones that are public, and you go through their filings, you realize like most weight loss products keep people for like 2, 3, 4 months.
Hmm.
And at the end of that, you're either going to have lost the weight or you're going to have given up.
Yep.
And to a certain extent, you have to kind of design the business around that. Either knowing you can't overspend on acquisition to acquire people because you can't push LTV much past that, or you build other products that like compensate for that in some way.
Yeah, kind of extend the reason for them to stick around or extend the reason for them
Yeah,
to,
exactly.
so you can use that customer acquisition cost initially upfront for more than just the 2, 3 months that they'll stick around. That's already
Exactly.
optimizing. So also an interesting question. Would you, when you think about optimization, do you think about optimizing the price for a new user, or do you think about how do we decrease churn? Where do those fit into
It's a great question.
the
Yeah, I think
hierarchy?
in those kind of like six layers that I laid out, the way I typically approach this, if everything's equal, I would start from the bottom of that stack and work upwards.
Hmm.
The reason for that is like the best practices at the bottom are much clearer than the best practices at the top. So really do because time is such a factor in subscription products
Hmm.
that you want to get wins on the board as early as possible while you give yourself time to work on the harder problems.
Yeah.
So like finding, people, if you have a two-tiered product, finding people in tier A who are successful and giving them emails and push notifications to upgrade to tier B at the right time. Like it's not that hard of a project to design, and you might as well
Hmm.
set that machinery up while you do something like work on pricing. Pricing tests can take 1, 2 months optimistically, or 3, 4, 5, 6 months. So you might as well have like an increase in monetization from the easier stuff while you work on the harder stuff.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, especially with all this is recurring. So if it starts working out, it will continue to work out as you do more and more and
Exactly.
more things. Other than something like optimizing that conversion from one tier to the other, what other type of kind of easy, low-hanging fruit would you recommend looking at?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say like the easiest things to do to start is like set up decent onboarding. Try to
Okay.
understand like the personas that you have
Hmm.
entering the product, and like start to track who is and who is not successful.
Yeah. Wow, that's a great idea. I mean, a lot of people talk about onboarding and the importance, and I know that's something that we have even struggled with over time because as the
Yep.
product changes, the product grows and increases and targets more users or offers features for more users. It's the last thing you want to think about, how to get them to start with it. But that's really the first thing you need to think about because if they're not starting with it, you might as well not even build features, the way I see it at this
Yep.
point.
100%.
Took me so long
Yeah,
to figure that out.
a great second tactic is like, especially if your product is older and like you're not the original founder and the original engineers are no longer around, there's probably like a lot of edge cases and bugs that get like lost and forgotten in the day-to-day life cycle of working in a tech company.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
like go kind of from beginning to end of the product, dump every screenshot into a mirror board. This is exactly what I do for clients, and just highlight everything that's like broken,
Mm.
confusing, CTAs that are not above the fold, like upsells that are unclear or mistimed. You'd always be like shocked the amount of just like bugs and confusion areas you find.
I fully believe it. So you said two interesting things. CTA is not about above the fold, which is a problem that I see in so many apps these days, and I'm not sure I
Yep.
understand why. And we're talking even bigger apps, big apps. Some of the
Yep.
AI apps, some of these new browsers that everyone is talking about on Twitter or on X, and they a lot of them are making the same mistakes. Why do you think that is?
I think as companies grow, like maybe the biggest problem in big companies is like the gap between how everyone thinks the product works and how the product really works.
Hmm.
Like a huge advantage you have coming in with fresh eyes, either as a new employee or as a consultant, is like you don't have a lot of context, so the product is the only thing you have to go on,
Hmm.
which in a way makes it like weirdly easy to spot what's going to work
Yeah.
because you don't have like the 5 year context of how we got to this feature set.
Hmm.
You just know what the feature set is right now and if it makes sense
Yeah.
initially. I think other tactics that are really like cheap to set up and useful is like timing surveys in the right places. So a place we almost always find gold with clients is setting surveys up right after purchase
Okay.
that ask users like if there's anything that confused them during the purchase experience. Was there anything that almost prevented you from buying this product? And just like
Interesting.
piping that into a Slack channel.
And people
Because
actually
if
respond to
you
those?
maybe 1 in 20, but it
Hmm.
depends on your purchase volume. You
Yeah.
get, a handful a day. Most of them say nothing of value, but
Okay.
it's really like it's so cheap to set up
Yeah.
that you catch bad bugs in weird edge cases like once every 2 or 3 weeks
Oh,
that you would have never known are there.
that's super valuable. I think that's something we should do now that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, it's one of the first things we always do. We almost always find stuff. I think it's a strategy that you could push even further. And like anytime someone goes through a conversion point,
Hmm.
like you should be asking them like, did anything give you pause before you bought this product?
Yeah, that makes a lot of
Or,
sense.
yeah, what bumps did you hit along the way?
How complicated would you say a survey like that can be? Are we talking one question that's multiple choice with no open-ended text boxes, or are you free to ask more because you're not going to get it most of the time? So the one time you
It's a
get it
good question.
might as well be
I
good.
think typically we only ask one question open-ended.
Okay. Ooh,
And I
one
think
question
like
open-ended. Okay.
yeah, I think it lowers the response rate, obviously, but it means the detail you get back is a lot higher.
Okay.
I think there's like a bias you introduce to multiple choice surveys
Absolutely.
because they're what you think the answers are,
Hmm.
which like inherently there might be a thing you don't know about that is the valuable thing.
Yeah. And leaving an other, I think in all my experiences with an other box on a multiple choice, you rarely get an other because someone will just fit whatever it is that they're
Yep.
thinking into whatever it is you wanted. And yeah, the results are not always as super useful.
Exactly. We see the same thing in cancellation surveys for web apps, where
Hmm.
like if you don't both have the right universe of reasons and you don't have like a happy reason for canceling. Like I came here to learn German, I now know enough German, I'm leaving.
Yeah,
Like
makes
if not,
sense.
people just choose a random answer and it
Hmm.
like makes the data useless.
Yeah, we ran into the same problem with our cancellation questions, and we learned the same lesson. It just
Yep.
so you end up either having a million features or a million options and hope that one of them is close enough and will actually work when you look at it over a large amount of data. But it doesn't always work that way, as we learned.
Yep. Exactly.
So it is problematic. But then, okay, so you collect, so it sounds like collecting a lot of data is an integral part of optimizing. And so when you think about optimizing and you think about this data, what is the ratio of, or how does that apply? Do you see if people say that the product is too expensive, do you immediately think, let's run a deal, or how does that translate?
It's a good question. I think the pricing question, every time I run pricing research or surveys, the number one objection is the product is too expensive. Which, like, just to put that into perspective for people, I think it's a little bit of a long time ago, so I'm kind of making these numbers up. But I'd say if we would run a pricing survey with 300 responses, 60% of them would tell us the price is too expensive. I don't know if that actually means the product is too expensive. The only way of determining that is like really price testing.
Yeah.
So I think all these are like inputs that should go into your product development process, but you shouldn't take any of them 100% literally.
Yeah, I
It's kind of like
completely agree.
the job of PMs and founders of like to take kind of like the cloud of data. And there's a lot of prioritization frameworks out there, like none of them are 100%. It's
Hmm.
really at some point you have to use judgment
Yeah.
and be informed by your data, but not kind of like ruled by it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think price optimization is probably one of the hardest thing that I've been challenged as a guy around a subscription
Yeah,
business. And it's not that the data is not there. There is a lot of data. We can ask people and they will always tell us what they think. And what they think doesn't necessarily align with what they're willing to do.
100%.
And I think that's
Yep.
really the key. So they think it's too expensive, but they will pay you twice as much because it is solving a need for them that they don't want to spend the time on, whether it's convenience or data acquisition or something else.
Exactly.
So it's always interesting to keep that in mind. So, how do you find ways to make the data maybe align more with actionable things when you ask a question?
Yeah, I think maybe the step before that, I think in any part of the business's growth, you have like in a maybe a 3 to 6 month like problem set that you're working on. So if
Hmm.
you think about monetizing a subscription business, the only really two levers that exist is like getting people to stay around longer, getting people to pay you more.
Hmm.
Those are like the only two kind of like components of LTV that like drive towards actually making the business more money.
Yeah.
So kind of at any given time, you should be deliberate in what you want to focus on.
Hmm.
So do you want to increase retention? Do you want to increase upfront user revenue? Do you want to increase conversion from a free tier or your existing audience into the paid product? Do you want to like expand into a new persona? That's kind of more of a strategy question
Yeah.
and like what the business like should be achieving right now. I
That's
think
interesting.
in my experience, like the most of the really valuable experiments we've run were like the second, third, or fourth attempt at a goal.
Okay.
So I think like a mistake that's really easy to fall into is like you want to, especially like a rank and file product manager,
Hmm.
you want to show like momentum to leadership. So you
Yeah.
keep like scattering your shots around because it makes project trackers look really good and alive
Hmm.
and busy. And it like you don't look as good
Yeah.
if you're just hammering like one thing over and over again. Unless that thing is really important and unlocking it increases the business by 30%.
Hmm.
Like then it's really valuable, but it's like
Yeah.
a harder war to fight for.
Yeah. And it's also the kind of thing that going into it, you may not be able to prove. You can't just say, I'm going to do this because it will definitely increase revenue by 30%. And even if you know,
Exactly.
if you don't have the receipts, no one's going to say, sure, take the next 6 months and don't do anything else. Nothing else.
100%. Yeah, I think the approach I think Uber was really good at was like balancing product roadmaps. So
Okay.
it's like you have like of, your engineering resources for the next 6 months, you're probably going to spend 30 to 40% on just like technical debt pay down work
Okay.
to keep the code base like to a place where it's easy to work in. You probably have like 25%, 30% of like stuff that just got to happen, like
Yeah.
space for bugs, requests from other teams, things just get out of date and need updating. And then the rest of the component are kind of like your big swings.
Hmm.
So these are things that like need a ton of due diligence. You need a ton of good headroom estimation. You need a lot of like research and iteration and good milestones within projects.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it's so hard to navigate these sort of things. But once you get it
Yeah,
down, or you have to get it down, I think that's really what it is. You have to get it down.
exactly. And I think like sometimes the I don't know, a trap that's easy to fall into in product management is like thinking there is a framework that will get you everywhere.
Yeah.
Where like in reality, we kind of do research for a living. So like you don't really know. You're
Yeah.
kind of guided by your intuition, and it's more about, in my experience, like de-risking projects, cutting scope down, like
Hmm.
finding creative ways of testing assumptions. Because like if we all knew the project that would, increase LTV by 50%, we'd all be doing it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's again a lot of interesting stuff in here, but we have some questions from the audience. So maybe we can start with a question.
Sure.
The first question is, well, it's not really a question. Someone is really interested in lowering churn, but I think you started talking about either you increase your retention or increase your price, and churn comes
Yep.
into increasing your retention. What's the entry level way to think about decreasing churn in the short term? What's
Yeah, it's a great
a
question.
low
So
hanging
I think
fruit?
churn breaks into kind of two categories. There's like voluntary churn where someone actively cancels a product, and then there's involuntary churn, which is like something technical happens that causes them to fall away from the product. So I first break your churn numbers into those two buckets because you kind of have to solve them differently.
Hmm.
So maybe we'll do the involuntary churn side first because it's just kind of smaller.
Yeah.
If you think of like technical problems that could prevent people from staying in your product, mostly they're payment problems, but
Hmm.
depending on what your product is, like I wear a Whoop strap. If this thing ever loses connection to my phone due to an Android update and I never get it back, I will cancel Whoop.
Yeah.
So it's like understanding the reasons that people fall away from the product. On the payment side, the App Store does most of that for you, but other things like incentivizing people to add backup payment methods, like sending emails or doing any marketing or push notifications when payments fails. The App Store does some of that, but any like
Yeah.
little bit of love you can put in that process, it's probably like a 1 week project. And it's a thing that just like runs in the background forever and lowers those numbers.
Yeah, I
I
think
think,
that's such an easy thing to do. And if you think about it that way, sorry to cut you off, but my
no,
mind
sure.
always goes into what can I run in the background that will help either decreasing churn, increasing retention, getting people to use a feature more, the kind of stuff that's fully automated. Because
Exactly.
that works 24/7 for you and that retains so much more than not doing anything.
100%. Then to go into the voluntary churn side, it's like
Hmm.
the two reasons where like people will leave. It's like they got all they needed from the product. So like they, like wanted to learn to cook Italian food and now they know enough and now they're gonna leave. So it's like you have to give them other things to do in the app, or for some reason they fell away from the product before they got the value. So I break the voluntary churn into kind of like those two buckets and like start to think about those differently. So as you mentioned, it's like the best way of fighting churn is upstream in the product. So by the time someone's in your cancellation flow, there's some things you can do to win them back, but it's mostly like they fell away from an earlier life cycle moment. And like what does the happy path look like? And are you steering people back onto it once they fall away from it?
I think that's a really good point. When someone falls out of love with your product, it doesn't happen immediately. So if you immediately try
No,
to get them
exactly.
back, you have to go either above and beyond or to do something really crazy like offer a discount or do something like that in order to really just hold them at the very obvious level. And I think those things are never really good for longevity, for LTV. They're good for maybe an immediate
100%.
gratification to show that we saved a person from churning, but you really didn't. So going
Yeah.
maybe deeper into that, what can you do at the end? So someone did reach that I'm churning, I'm leaving page or viewing the app. Is there a way to get them back? Should you even spend effort on trying to do that?
Yeah, great question. I think before we go down this, the caveat I would give here is like this is kind of a band-aid. But
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
you are bleeding users, so like you should use a band-aid while you work on the underlying problem. Like it's not necessarily bad, band-aids are
Yeah.
good, but recognize that it's not going to solve the core problem. So I think this tactic set is a little bit like agnostic to the app stores because the app stores limit your options a little bit here.
Hmm.
But I think if removing all the technical constraints, I would approach it like this: of like if you don't have any type of cancellation survey, I would first set up like an open-ended cancellation survey, run it for a month maybe,
Okay.
then have someone like map all the answers into categories for you. So
Okay.
we do that so you don't introduce kind of like bad results in your cancellation survey and have
Yeah.
people just choose random ones. So map the universe. I would also include kind of a happy reason for leaving of like you wanted to learn German. I now know German. I'm leaving.
Yeah.
Um, so once you have that set up, you can set up kind of like appeasements based on the answers. So
Mhm.
if you go to subscriptionindex.com, I have a database of a couple of these. Probably the gold standard is kind of like the New York Times does this really well.
Okay.
So not surprisingly, they have, millions of subscribers. If their cancellation survey lowers their churn like 1%, they
Hmm.
probably make millions of dollars back.
Yeah.
So they've tested probably almost everything that exists. So depending on what the person chooses in the survey, you kind of get one shot at appeasing them with something. So if it's like I need a break, you can let them pause the subscription for
Hmm.
like 1 or 2 months. Or like, I had technical problems, we can offer to connect you to customer service.
Yep.
I think Clear, the travel product, does this really well. That it probably the number one reason people are leaving is they're not traveling soon.
Hmm.
So when I went to cancel Clear, they offered to put it on pause for 2 months, and that just so happened to like overlap with the holidays in the U.S. where I was traveling again, and I don't want to take my daughter through a long security line. So that like kept me on the product, and then I renewed for another year. I
Oh.
think, as mentioned, it's like you'll have the most success with this if the thing you're offering them actually takes a step towards solving their problem. I think you see other
Yeah.
companies just kind of like spray discounts at the end, which
Yep.
like that might work. You run the risk of other people finding those and a bunch of people cashing in on them.
Yep. That's always my concern.
Yep. Yeah, again, like it's a band-aid. It has its value, but it's not going to solve the problem.
I think you said it very well. I think it is a band-aid, but if that band-aid can work towards solving the actual problem that they have in their minds for canceling, that can actually work really well, like pausing the subscription because you're not traveling, and eventually you signed up for another
Exactly.
year. So that worked really well for them, and really well for you too, because now you have it.
Exactly. And if you go back to like the time nature of subscriptions, it's like that's not that hard of a thing to set up.
Hmm.
And you should set it up. If you have the options, you should set it up quickly
Yep.
because it will work every month while you're solving the other problems.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of this, there's a question in the chat. Let me bring that up. Question from Glenn, who's saying, I have an education/reference app with 2 subscriptions, monthly and annual, and there's a 54% saving over monthly and the annual. Would you recommend trying a 1 week free trial that will go to annual?
It's a good question. I think to maybe answer a higher level question, like especially for things like education, where it's like a short-term use case product, driving people into annual plans is like maybe the best tactic that exists to make MRR grow faster. So we had this problem in Codecademy where like people don't learn to code forever. They do it for a finite amount of time.
Hmm.
So the more people you can get into longer term plans, it makes payment processing significantly easier because instead of like 12 attempts at a card, you only have to make one attempt at a card.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a big one.
it makes people commit to the product depending on how you're acquiring people. If you're relying on paid ads, you get the cash payback faster. You don't
Hmm.
run like the LTV risk of like not knowing, if you're spinning up TikTok ads for the first time, if the LTV in TikTok is going to be materially different than Facebook,
Yeah.
and you're going to end up underwater on the product. I think to answer the question specifically, I would use every tactic that exists to drive people to annual plans. I think it's one of like the tides that raises all boats for shorter life cycle subscription products. The number one thing we found that was valuable at Codecademy was pricing the annual plan at like 1 to 2 months more than your monthly LTV. So he's using a 54%
Okay.
discount. So it sounds like he could be doing that already.
Yeah.
But if you think someone stays around for 3 months, if you can get an annual plan priced at 4 or 5 months for the price of a monthly plan, every user you get into that bucket, you boost their LTV by like 20%.
Yeah, that's pretty easy.
And additionally, you get all of the value of the payment processing, the more cash in the business faster.
Hmm.
People commit to the product more. A percentage of those will renew for another year. It's one of those things that like I would use every tactic that exists. The main tactics that do exist is like pricing them correctly. So pricing tests come in here. If you don't have the capacity to run pricing tests, I would just make a change and monitor it.
Hmm.
Um, Using longer trial periods for the annual plan, calling out like the savings
Interesting.
clearly on the
Okay.
pages. we ran a really interesting test at Codecademy, which was kind of like an eye movement test. So like people's like eyes anchor on the cheaper price first.
Hmm.
So I think we ran like the more expensive monthly rate, which was the monthly plan, on the right, because they saw the cheaper annual plan on the left. And it sounds like a really stupid little thing, but it
Yeah.
boosted annual plan sales by like 11%.
It is not at all stupid. I tried that too. It made the whole page feel awkward to me, but it definitely works. It's super weird.
It definitely works.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that like it's not an unlimited set of tactics for annual plans, but you should try everything.
Yeah.
Like,
I totally agree. So I think the moral of this story, if you don't have an annual plan right now, you only have a monthly, go like don't wait. Just go implement an annual plan immediately because whatever you do, it's gonna be better than not having it.
yeah. The big caveat there is if your users are comfortably around for more than a year. So if you notice like your cell phone plan doesn't give you an annual plan option because you're going to be using your cell phone for
Hmm.
20 years.
Yeah. You're kind of stuck.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think they probably don't need the cash as much as someone who's just starting out or
Same.
has an app who wants to build more forward.
Exactly. I don't know, I think a lot about annual plans. The only other thing to consider is it's a little tough to figure out in the App Store data. It's like, what is your monthly plan payment processing fail rate?
Hmm.
So if you think of like, if you took on 100 people in January and you're failing, 5% of payments every month, how many would you have left by the end of December?
Yeah.
You can think of it as like a discount window.
Hmm.
You could discount annual plans up to that level.
That's a good way of looking at it when you try to
Yeah,
optimize your price. And that leads me to what I really want to think about, and that is how do you A B test pricing? Because it sounds like if
great question.
annual is so important, then any sort of modification, now we're talking the monthly times some number, making sure that's super perfect is probably going to increase revenue. How do you go about that?
Yeah, great question. I'd say the caveats before we jump into pricing testing is really powerful, but also like complicated to run. It's also, in my experience, like triggers the most, I don't know, anxiety and existential questions amongst founders and executives around the
Absolutely.
product. So yeah, I'd like your smile there knowingly. So I think if you were proposing something like this and you're a product manager, or if you're the founder of it, just know that like anxiety rush is coming
Hmm.
because it's kind of like a Schrodinger's cat moment of like you think you could charge more, but we're about to really learn.
Yep.
Like if you could charge more. So I'd give kind of like everybody in your company a little bit of extra love, like going into it and explaining why and setting up good break glass metrics and monitoring and all that good stuff. So I think about pricing steps, assuming you want to run a pricing test.
Hmm.
Uh, I would think about it this way. There's a universe of pricing research that exists, like Price Intelligently wrote a bunch of great things on this about like how you do pricing research. Pricing research, if you were a big company, is valuable because you're going to get less shots at the test
Hmm.
before you kind of like lose the political momentum behind you. That said, pricing research still has a relatively wide error margin. So like just because you get a result back in a pricing survey doesn't really tell you what someone would have paid for that.
Yeah.
Tests are the only way of doing that.
Absolutely.
So if you think about a pricing test, I would do it kind of like in these levels. Determine what you want the control of the variant to be. So as you're getting ready for a test, I would like go through all of your site and documentation, everything, and scrub your
Okay.
pricing packages away from any area that someone in the variant side of the test could see. So like FAQ pages, like
Mm,
old ad campaigns that aren't running
super
anymore.
valid point.
Yeah, this is where pricing tests typically blow up, where you get like a week into it and you get a small user rebellion because like someone saw a different price. You want to make sure like once they're hitting the site, it's consistent.
Hmm.
After that is kind of like test design. So the North Star KPI we normally use for pricing tests is like revenue per allocated user.
Okay.
So if you take like the total revenue that side of the test makes and then divide it by the user count, you get like a number that will distribute normally across a distribution. The reason that's helpful is like you might not want to run a 50-50 split in your test depending on the level of risk you feel.
Hmm.
So I think when we did this at Codecademy, we ran 80/20s just
Okay.
because like we didn't want to put a ton of revenue on the line in
Hmm.
the off chance that we're wrong because we're still trying to hit revenue targets. I would also, in the test design, try to capture as many like subjective metrics of like user activation, basically. So like, do people come in? Do they use the app normally? Are they watching the normal number of videos? Are they using the normal number of features? You want to make sure that like you're not overly skewing the usage side of it. You'll probably see like less conversions, but using the revenue per allocated user as the North Star allows you to see like net does each side of
Yeah.
this bucket make more money. And that would include like a lot of break glass metrics, anything that could go wrong, such as like cancellations, refunds. If you're running a monthly subscription, you typically want to run month one churn
Hmm.
and run the test through the end of month one. The tricky side of pricing tests is you don't really know, and it's kind of impractical to run it for 12 months and like
Yeah.
really understand what it's going to do for everything.
Yeah.
So that's
Okay.
kind of test design. I
Hmm.
think uh, I would look at like the statistical significance. There's a concept called minimum detectable effect, which you can look up and try to get an understanding of before you run a test. What is the threshold that we have to pass in this time window to be statistically confident,
Yeah.
like in the test itself. So don't launch a test that you won't be able to get to a statistical level for like 9 months because it just takes way too long in the life of startups.
Yeah. And you might be losing or you might be hurting your metrics at the end of the day without knowing.
Exactly.
So
I
there.
think in
Oh,
the I was
no,
going
go
to
ahead.
say in the universe where you find a pricing package that works better than your existing one, we did two things at Codecademy that I thought were smart. Like I would announce it to the users. You have to give like a reason you're raising your prices.
Yeah.
I think Patrick Campbell, who founded Profitwell, has a great quote that's something like your price is the like exchange metric for value of your product.
Hmm.
So it's basically the exchange rate for how valuable the product is.
Yeah.
So the typical narrative is something like we've invested XYZ in the product in the last 12 to 24 months, and we want to keep investing. And therefore, like we have to raise the prices a little bit.
Yeah.
I would pair that with like a small marketing campaign where you're like
Interesting.
telling people this is the last time that they can get the existing prices. It's not going to like change the world, but it's like a relatively easy way to boost that month's revenue by like 20%.
Oh,
I
interesting.
think, yeah, after that, we also put in, again, we were a web app, so we had more control over our cancellation flow.
Yeah.
We then put in a cancellation flow if those users were on a price that was no longer public and gave them the option to like pause and stay around in that price and told them like if they cancel, they lose the ability to come back at that rate.
Yeah. That makes sense. That just makes sense. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
So many things that I want to dive into from here, but there's a question that I think is a good question to bring up on the screen. Rachel is asking, retention has declined recently, and I'm considering a lifetime subscription to boost cash flow. However, I'm worried it might detract from yearly subscribers. What's your view on this, and what's your view in general on lifetime? Is that does that hurt subscriptions? Is that good for business? I know all my thoughts on it. I'll put them at the end.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you look at like the evolution of major subscription products, a lot of them start with lifetime plans and then like slowly shutter those.
Yeah.
So if you look at like Calm and Headspace and use the Wayback Machine and go back to when they launched, they all
Hmm.
had lifetime subscription plans. My guess is they're doing it for the cash flow to
Hmm.
start.
Yeah.
I think pricing those is really tricky because the only way you know LTV is when that cohort of users reaches zero.
Yeah.
Uh, and like if you have a good product where people stay around, that will be a really long time. So knowing that you like priced the lifetime plan correctly, quote unquote, is really difficult.
Hmm.
There's that like famous, I want to say American Airlines or United story with Mark Cuban, where a bunch of people bought like lifetime first class flights. And that was like the worst deal they ever made because those people flew weekly. So like if you have any cost to serve your product, lifetime feels a little risky. If it's the beginning and you just want a bunch of cash up front, that could help. But again, it's not going to fix the underlying retention
Yeah.
problem. It's just going to come paper over it.
I think that goes back to the band-aid. Why is retention
Yep,
declining? If we can figure out why retention is going down, is it a feature problem? Is there not enough up at the top of the funnel because maybe we need more advertising or
exactly.
something like that? Those would be much easier to fix than now to get stuck with a user who's never going to pay you again and will probably demand additional everything,
Yeah, exactly.
which is kind of the way I see it. So going back into what you were saying before about price testing, you said two things that I think are really interesting. And for the audience, then you have to leave us in about 10 minutes. So we have about 10 minutes
Yep.
with Dan to ask more questions. And I will stick around for about 10 more minutes so I can answer more questions from the chat. And I'll try to channel my inner Dan to help bring this to. But So two things you said. One that you split 80/20, and the split 80/20 kind of makes sense to me. But you also said that you change it for more users. Do you change the price when you test prices? Would you recommend testing them on existing users and new users, or only on those 20% of new users?
It's a good question. I think the lower risk way of doing it is just new users. And I
Hmm.
think in a way you get like a cleaner signal
Yep.
on the value of the product with just the new user base.
Yeah.
I think when I was at Codecademy, didn't raise prices on existing users. That might
Hmm.
have changed since then. I think that is like the riskiest
Yeah.
pricing
Absolutely.
move. Um, but I do think like I don't know, it's kind of a personal matter of taste. It depends a little bit on your retention too.
Yeah.
Like if all your users are going to cycle out
Yeah.
in a 12-month period anyway, and maybe you'll have 10% from the year before, like I wouldn't risk changing existing users. But if you're someone like Netflix or Spotify who retains for a really, really long time, most of your users are existing users.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think the less the more risk you take away from this, the more you can have better results and longer term experiments. That's what we've done
Agreed.
forever. When we ran our first test, we were already years into ad figures, and I was so concerned that everyone will just somehow know that we're running a
Yep.
test, and we'll just get very angry and leave. No one found out, no one cared, and even the people who
Yep.
did notice it said, "Hey, are you testing your pricing?" And I was like, "Yeah, I want to make more money." They're like, "Cool."
Yep.
So that's
Yeah, a
ultimately
little
my experience.
we found the exact same thing. And like a little thing you can do to help alleviate anxiety is like prepare your customer service team with appeasements.
Hmm.
So like before the test, like, hey, if someone reaches out, this is the answer. If they're really upset, like this is an acceptable discount.
Yep, exactly. Or give them the
But
other
yeah,
price if it's lower or something like that, which has
exactly.
worked.
Tons of anxiety come up in pricing tests.
Yeah. And in my experience, most of that anxiety is us. The users don't really care for the
100%.
most part. They don't even realize for the most part. And I think when you have a product that people need, if there's a difference of $1 or $5 or whatever it is, a small percentage of dollars, they're not even going to care because they need it. It gets
Yeah,
into
exactly.
if it's something that they don't really need and it's something that they want, and now it's a bigger question. And if you increase the price by 100%, now we're in a weird territory.
Totally agree.
So I imagine the advice would be not to do that. So that makes sense. Um,
Yeah.
but something else that you said, and a great article on your blog that I would highly recommend for everyone to read, is about metrics and reviewing metrics. So can you tell us more about what sort of metrics do you look at? What is a metrics review in your view, and how often should people even look at those numbers? Is there too
Yeah, it's
much,
a great
too
question.
little?
So if you think about like the cycle of product development kind of works in a loop. You have kind of like what is the universe of things we could do? What are we picking? Like what's the scope of the solution? Shipping it, and then like did the thing do what we thought it was going to do? Almost everybody skips that step. And we just like blindly come back to the beginning and like get infatuated with a new idea. I think it's arguably the most important part of like actually growing a product, but it's also extremely difficult. So I think when you think about a subscription business, there's kind of the big North Star metrics of like acquisition rates, conversion rates, retention rates, usage rates, lifetime value, month-over-month churn. And those are kind of like if you think of a company dashboard, those are like the big numbers. They're going to be at the top that like everybody's going to try to move. When you think about designing projects, though, you have to go like multiple levels below those numbers to find operational metrics that like you can actually ship something to move. So it'll be like your checkout page conversion rate, like your opt-in rate for notifications, the like onboarding filler at the email open rates of the onboarding messages. And it's like metrics review is the process of like breaking down your big numbers into the operational metrics and holding typically a meeting amongst the product managers and executives where they try to explain why the big numbers move. And it's like partially a thought exercise. I think the wrong tone for those meetings is like executives hammering product managers when churn drops 3% and they didn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
But it's really like allows the product managers to like deeply understand their areas and like what the biggest drivers are. I think it's tricky to do because you need really good tracking set up. You typically need like good self-service dashboards set up.
Hmm.
And like you need a fast enough cadence where every meeting will kind of end in questions. And you need to be able to answer those questions by the next meeting, or you just get a backlog of questions and you get kind of jammed up.
Yeah, I can totally see that. we were talking about this before. So now figures we have a lot of different reports for subscriptions that show you trends over time by
Yep.
country, all those different little ways to view it. And Apple at this point has more than 70 different metrics that you can take a look at. And most of them are really irrelevant and in the grand scheme of things, but really specifically relevant
Yep.
when you're trying to optimize. And we're always thinking, what is the ultimate dashboard that will show you everything you need to see at a glance, both the high level and the low level? And we have not found the answer
100%.
yet. That's why we don't have that.
No, I think in Codecademy we used Looker, which I think was good at the time. And
Hmm.
it's like it was the self-service part of it that was really helpful. And it
Hmm.
like it's almost I think most of the out-of-the-box dashboards aren't going to give you enough detail
Yeah.
to like really answer a question. Like one of the best projects we ever did at Codecademy was like we rewrote all of the checkout page error copy. So it
Okay.
went from like generic your card is declined to like telling people exactly what to fix. And
Interesting.
like we kind of thought of it once we started to break apart our payment fail reasons after we started looking at checkout page conversion rate. And from like an ROI of a project, you're just rewriting copy. It maybe took 24 hours.
And that
But
actually
like
gave you
because we're
a
like,
real boost.
yeah. I mean,
Wow.
I think it depends a lot on like how many international users you
Hmm.
have. There's a lot of like nuance within payment processing.
Yep. Absolutely.
But like maybe it boosted checkout conversion, I don't know, 1 to 5%.
That's incredible.
But it's a pretty, yeah. I mean, checkout page conversion is equal to new revenue.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
1% increase in checkout conversion is 1% in new revenue.
Hmm.
So, but it's like the type of thing we would have never found
Wow.
unless we were going really deep in numbers.
And that's super easy. Man, that's
Yeah, super easy. Those are my favorite projects.
there are so many nuggets in this. I'm gonna have to rewatch this later and just outline all of the little things that we went through because I started by memorizing them and then I stopped because there's just too much. So I'll do that
Yeah,
later.
that's okay. Also, always happy to chat again. I feel like I think and talk about subscription products all day, every day. I think my goal in writing the blog is to write the thing that I wish I had 5 years ago
That's
when like
nice.
I was trying to figure these things out. Because I think I don't know, not to get I don't know, all emotional about it, but it's like so many products don't survive
Hmm.
because they don't set up monetization systems effectively. And it's like if you think about what goes into launching something, both on the money raising side, but also like that person's personal life
Hmm.
to like get things together to start a startup, to find a product that works, and then they die because they don't have the monetization system set up.
Yeah.
When they actually hit a product that works, and that is so difficult.
Yeah.
They're like, I'm happy to pass on all of my learnings that I can.
That's great. I keep saying every time we talk about subscriptions on the show, I keep saying that it's really easy to fail with subscriptions, and people get that confused
Yep.
with it's really easy to for things not to work at all. But I find there's a middle ground that is actually much more worrying, whereas stuff works, but just not well. And so for the longest time,
Exactly.
you can run a subscription business and make recurring revenue that is just not enough to stay afloat. And eventually you have to give up. And I talked to so many developers who said that they fell into the same sort of fell into
Yep.
these mistakes by not optimizing, not thinking about the right metrics, not really thinking about the difference between annual and monthly and those little optimizations even. And I bet you they're not thinking about how to change the copy on their errors.
Yeah.
And they're still making money. So in the grand scheme of things, they're happy. Money is continuing to come into my bank account, but it's not nearly as much as you can get out of it, or not nearly as much as you need to really grow and thrive. It's the whole I
Exactly.
thrive versus survive, and it's so easy to survive with subscriptions, not as easy to thrive unless you actually try.
100%. Yeah, and I feel like just the best practices in this world aren't as well understood just because
Hmm.
there's fewer subscription products than there are e-commerce products.
Yeah,
And just like
absolutely.
fewer people write things down in this world
Hmm.
than the paid ads world.
Yeah, that's totally true. Well, for everyone who hasn't heard my intro, you should go and subscribe to Dan's newsletter, Subscription Index. All of his thoughts and knowledge go into it. Is there anything else, Dan, that you wanna show off with before you go?
No, I think yeah, the newsletter is where I kind of put my best and brightest. I think I have limited capacity for consulting, so it's not a very high level newsletter. It goes very deep into tactics and like the things that I see work
Yeah,
across the industry.
definitely in depth. I love reading the articles. I went through all the articles or most of the articles before the show, and I feel like I'm much smarter now. So,
Oh, appreciate that. Yeah, I feel like writing is always a mix of boring and terrifying.
yeah,
So yeah, I'm always
absolutely.
happy when people get the value out of it.
Absolutely. I do a lot of writing, so I know exactly what it's like. It's always a
Yes.
challenge.
Yep.
But thank you very much, Dan. If anyone wants to find you, we'll include your information in the description later. Is LinkedIn the best place to talk to you? on the
Yeah,
internet?
LinkedIn's good. There's a contact form on my blog. My
Oh,
email is
perfect.
dan@subscriptionindex.com, and any of those work.
Easy. So we'll include all those. Maybe we'll mask the email so you don't get spam. All those
Oh, well, appreciate that.
in the video description for later for everyone who wants to talk to you about subscriptions and making more money. Dan, thank you very much for coming and
Perfect.
doing
Thanks,
this.
everyone.
I'll stick around for a few more minutes and try to get some questions from the chat. Bye bye, Dan.
Awesome. Thanks, Ariel.
Alrighty, so I'm here alone and I have a whole bunch of questions in the chat. Let's see how many I can get through. I kind of lost track of where I was, so I'll dive into whatever makes sense. If you have any more questions, we have about 10 minutes, so throw them in. But let's see. Talk Now is saying we have discounted pricing for first-time subscribers. Some of them cancel before next billing cycle, but continue to use the free version. Any help on how to win them back? And that's a great question. I hear this all the time because subscription pricing, and especially discounted entry-level pricing or first-time pricing, is kind of a weird thing. If you are trying to incentivize people to come in, but you don't hook them enough, they will take your discount and leave. So going back to what we were talking about with Dan, if you can understand why people stay, do people really need your app for more than a month? If you can figure that out, do it. And if you can't, test without the discounted pricing, because ultimately, if those people are not sticking around, your LTV is considerably lower and it's bringing down everything. So I would look into either removing the discounted first-time pricing or figuring out why they're not sticking around. Do they even need the product for more than a month? And depending on what it is, the answer might be no. And if the answer is no, then you can think about something else. Maybe think about weekly pricing, and then that price can be a little bit higher, but still discounted from the monthly, and that's how you do it. Or introduce some way of, like Dan said, getting them into yearly pricing. And that's going to be your best way to get to a higher LTV, ultimately. Ooh, okay, this is a question that's slightly relevant, but I want to bring it up. I just got my financial report from Apple, and it has ignored all of my US sales for the month. Do you have any ideas how to fix this? I do and I don't. So Apple has had these issues a few times over the last few months. And every time that happens, it tends to happen to a small number of developers. We usually tell Apple about this and they usually fix it. We told Apple about a bunch of these over the last few months, and we always tell them, so if this happens to you, open a live chat with us. We'll verify that's the case with you and there's not something else going on, and then we'll talk to Apple if this is really the issue. You can also talk to Apple directly. I mean, obviously, that could maybe work. Let's see. Rachel is asking, feedback from X market indicates our pricing is too high from default market. Would you adjust the pricing in different regions to attract new subscribers? How would you handle existing subscribers? That's a great question. Something I wanted to talk to Dan about. He has a great article on his blog about localizing pricing, which I highly recommend reading. I'll drop a link to his blog in the description in just a little bit after this video is done. So come back, check it out. It's the subscriptionindex.com, and scroll down a little bit. I was just reading it before the talk, and I really wanted to talk to him about it, but we ran out of time, so we'll have to come back and do it. I think the moral of the story is, yes, you definitely want to try localizing your pricing, and it's not as easy. It's not very difficult. It's somewhere in the middle, depending on how much time you want to invest. And you have to think about the way people spend money in those different regions. Are they spending less money because they have less money? Are they spending less money because it's less common to spend money? And so once you figure that out, then you can figure out what works. And in general, through the App Store, through Google Play, you can kind of easily do that. So start with that, give it a little bit of time, and see what happens. I don't think existing users have any sort of way to really hate you for this, because for the most part, they just don't know. But if it does come up, like Dan was saying, always be ready to try and please them, meaning if it's a lower price, move them to the lower price. All right, what else do we have? Okay, a follow-up. Dennis is saying sometimes US sales data arrives later than others. That is also very true. But if you've waited enough, then that probably is not the case. Okay, another question about app figures. Can you please explain App Store Revenue Index? So for those of you who don't know, App Figures compiles a revenue index for the App Store and for Google Play for all of the apps and games, and all the apps, all the games, and all the different categories for all the different countries. And our idea was, you know how stocks have some sort of an index that you can look at and using something that isn't the absolute value of all the revenue in the market, figure out if it's growing or shrinking. A very easy way to tell if things are going up or things are going down. And that's exactly what the revenue index does. The download index does the exact same thing for downloads. It relies on our app intelligence to figure out what is the top of a category or the top of the app store, how much money is it making, and it indexes it back to a reference point back in time so it's all consistent. We compare it to 2017 because before 2017 and after 2017, there were major shifts in the App Store. So if you look at downloads, you can see that downloads have been going down over time. And you can look that across many categories, many countries. The trend is kind of the same. There are fewer downloads overall. But if you look at revenue, you can see that there is way more revenue than there was a few years ago. So revenue is growing much faster than downloads are shrinking. And the idea behind the index and the reason why we make it available to all of our members without having to charge them extra, you can even get it on our free plan, is you need visibility. You need to know if the things that you're doing, whether it's App Store optimization because you watch one of my videos, or if it's subscription optimization because you read Dan's blog, or if it's something about your advertising, if you need to know if your app is doing better or worse, and you need to be able to benchmark it to the real what's happening in the store, meaning you're doing nothing and revenue is going up, you're not really doing anything for that because revenue can go down. But if you're doing something, how do you know if it's working better or worse than the rest? And the index really does that. That was kind of the whole goal with it, to give you a way to benchmark what's happening with your app to what's happening globally. Let's see what else we have on this. More questions, more things about financial reports. I'll leave them in the chat for people to write. Something totally unrelated, but we'll always talk about ASL on these things, so why not? How much time do you wait between two changes on ASL keywords? And on the App Store, about 2 to 3 weeks. On Google Play, about 4 to 6 weeks. That's the easy answer. I'm going to talk about App Store optimization in my next live stream in a few weeks. So make sure you're subscribed to my newsletter to know that I'm going to do it again. And make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel so you'll get a notification. And I always forget to do this, but if you liked what we're doing today, give this video a like, not the little heart next to the chat, the actual like below the video so YouTube knows that it's really awesome, and make sure all the world knows it and everyone can improve their subscriptions and make more money. Unless they're your competitors. Let's pretend your competitors are not watching this for sure. Okay, let's see. What else? I'm looking for questions. There's a lot going on here. Okay, one last question that I think will take us to the end. But John is asking, I have a lottery app, and it's doing well, but we got some 1 stars because we require users to register to use our scanner. We're thinking of removing that and using device ID so users can try it out. Interesting question, and I've been asked about this a lot, especially from companies who have AI apps lately, because almost everyone has an AI app and no one wants any sort of sign up. I think it's tough. It's a tough one because there is the potential for confusion. There is the potential for someone, especially if you have an app that works between Google and Apple, someone switching devices and losing all of their whatever history or anything else that you have. But I would say test it. I don't think there's an easy way to know just by thinking about it, because every user base is just a little bit different. And I have a sneaking suspicion that when it comes to lottery apps, people just want to use it. They don't necessarily want to think about, let me sign up, let me make an account, let me put on my avatar. No one cares about that as much because it's not something they tie themselves to. And instead, it would be easier for them to just get started. So I think that's probably a good idea to experiment with. But like Dan was saying, make sure you watch your metrics and you review your metrics. And I highly recommend reading the article he has on his blog about this, about metric review, because if you're looking at the right things, you will know if it's working or not. And if it's the kind of break glass metric, which should just make sense, something that if it happens, you stop everything and you undo, then you know that you can't really go wrong with this. You can't lose as much. Worst case scenario, just undo it. Your code will be a little bit more complicated because now you have to handle 2 use cases of users with a device ID and users with an actual account. But I mean, on the road to optimizing revenue, that's usually how these things happen. And I think that's all the time we have for questions. I'm going to try and go through the questions in the chat and answer them in the video comments later on. If you have any more questions and want to get them answered, leave them in the comments after this video is done. And I will try to go through and answer them, which I say every time and then I do every time. So if you if you want to get them answered, come back to the video. That's pretty much all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. We're going to be talking more about subscriptions. Usually I talk about App Store optimization, but I want to bring a fuller picture to this to these videos to give you an idea of how to make more money all the way from the beginning, how to get more people into your app, and then what to do with them when they're in the app. So if you have any specific topics you want me to cover in the future, please let me know. Drop them as a comment on the video or hit me up on Twitter/X or LinkedIn. I'm usually available on all of those. I would love to hear what you think. And that's pretty much all I have for you today. Again, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, leave the video a like. I have to optimize. That's usually how it is. And I'll see you in a few weeks for a live chat about App Store optimization and potentially even search ads. We'll see. Mostly App Store optimization. Alrighty, that's it for me. I'll see you in a few weeks. Bye-bye.